The characters have come into a treasure room, and there is a glowing idol with big gem eyes staring right at them. One of the characters says, I will go forth and take a look at this idol using Arcana. And you get excited, getting ready to see what this character and their player is going to roll, when you realize, looking around the table, that everybody else is also picking up their dice, getting ready to roll as well. Is that okay? And how about if one of the other players says, I cast guidance, and another one, I help you? Is that cool? What is happening to the math of the game? How does it impact play? Let's take a look at all of this right now. In a recent video, I looked at what it means to fail a check and whether you can try again. A lot of the discussion there really focused on the underpinnings and basics of making skill checks or tests in Draw Steel or any number of RPGs. You know, a lot of those basics were in that video, so you may enjoy watching that first, but this video will absolutely work just on its own. So what we're going to do is talk about the idea of multiple characters wanting to be involved or otherwise assisting one character that is making the test. Now, first thing I want to make as a point is that while I will use Dungeons & Dragons because the D20 is very easy for math examples and a lot of folks understand the concept of what we're talking about in terms of the dice and the probabilities, this same concept applies to just about any RPG you can think about where there are dice being rolled and there's some target number, right? When that happens, the game is going to have a math that it expects, and the way we play together will impact it. I'll make a few points around some common games that are in the spotlight these days, but otherwise, just know that when I'm using D20 or D&D, this applies to any game that you enjoy. If you're like me, you play a bunch of different RPGs. So one of the things I want to talk about before we get into probability and multiple and so on is just the idea of good play and to set some expectations for good players that we want to do. If you've played a lot in organized play where you play at conventions, things like that, you will have a lot of experiences that I hopefully will help you get to what I'm talking about. But I want to set this down as a sort of baseline for just good play in general, which is we want to respect the player that comes up with an idea, right? So if that character steps forward and says, ooh, I want to take a look at the idol, they're in the spotlight. They made that call, right? It's their idea to go do this. And if we cut them off, as sometimes you'll see at tables, right? Someone says, I want to go look at that idol. And somebody says, yeah, I roll Arcana. And they just start rolling, kind of cutting off, stepping over to the other player. That's not generally cool, right? We want to think of the player that came up with an idea as having the momentum and the priority. They're in the spotlight. It's their scene, their idea, and we want to respect that, right? We want to, as a default for good play, respect the person that has that momentum. Know, and it can be hard because we're excited, we love the game, there will be other chances for our character to shine, and we want to let the scene be about that other character this time. In turn, when it becomes our turn, when later we come up with an idea, we propose something, we want the rest of the table to be chill and let us carry forward with that so that we're not cut off, right? We don't want a game where everybody's cutting each other off all the time, trying to beat them to the roll. That's not cool. So in general, respect the person that has the momentum or the spotlight. Never just roll right away when something is discussed, right? Even if the DM says something like, yeah, make me an Arcana check. That does not mean you, the other player that's not in the spotlight, should pick up dice and start rolling. Wait, see what's happening. Ask, right? Especially if, let's say that the barbarian was in the front and they ask about this idol. Maybe not even specifically saying they want to do a check, but something like, can we figure out what this idol's about? And that's my barbarian voice, apparently. And, you are playing the elven wizard that has studied magical statues as their backstory, right? It's perfectly acceptable, both in the fiction of the game and in the gameplay table, to say, hey, I want to pause and ask, barbarian, is this something you want to do? Like, do you feel good about this? Or are you just proposing this idea and do you want someone else to maybe try it? And let that play the way it is, right? But you bring it up and say, like, as your barbarian would know, my entire backstory is built on glowing idols. Is that cool? Just don't do this every time, right? Do it when it makes sense in the fiction of the game. Or also, another thing is, if let's say that you know that this is the most trapped treasure vault ever and super dangerous, well, tactically, it makes sense for all of you to pause and say, "Whoop, can I pause play for a second? Hey, everybody, we know this is super tough. My wizard is really good at Arcana. I mean, do you want to make that check? Or are you looking for help?" And that's great, right? We have a dialogue like adults. We think about who should make this test, and we can do that. But our default is not about proving that our character should do the role or that we, the player, should have our ego invested in making the role. It's about the idea of sharing, right? And letting that person who's in the spotlight go with it. Conversely, when you are that character that's not particularly good at something and you've maybe proposed an action, you can think of, well, what I actually want to do is I want to pause and ask if somebody else should take a look at that, right? And that creates this whole, when we all approach the game this way through rules for good play, right? We will create a better situation where we're going to have more fun. And the DM as well, because the DM's not having to adjudicate this if the players do it themselves through good play. And I want to emphasize again, don't just roll dice, right? Let the DM signal that a check can be attempted, and to designate who can or can't roll so that your DM is comfortable with the situation as well. Don't just assume that everybody can roll or just yell out guidance or yell out helping. Propose it. Try to be in the fiction of it. Try to make it that it makes sense. And honestly, what will happen is you will increase your chances that the DM will approve it if you sweet talk them into it, right? If you make a really cool role-playing show of casting guidance, chances are that might get approved, right? Or at least better chances than if you just say, I cast guidance every 3 seconds. All right, last thing in the basics, why do we care? And the reason we care about all this, the reason this entire video is being made is because this is a game where any of the role-playing games that we love, or almost all of them, anything that uses dice and probabilities, designers have crafted this game such that the probability of the dice is adjudicating the rough expected chance of results, right? We have things in Dungeons & Dragons, for example, a table of expected difficulty classes, right? Like 5, 10, 15. And 5 is trivial and 10 is easy and 15 is moderate. That is an underpinning of the game. We are also expecting on the other side that you're rolling a d20 and you're adding a bonus. And if you look at my Adventure Tools spreadsheet available to Patreon folks, you can see a nice table there that I made with help from Merrick Blackman that has these probabilities that you can expect, or the bonuses to be expected by different tiers of PCs based on whether they're skilled and so on. And so you can see that it actually varies a fair bit between players, or between characters, I should say, but there is an expectation there, right, on the math side of how good the character is and how difficult something is. So that game is being based that way. This is also true in a game like Alien or Night's Black Agents, in Daggerheart, in Draw Steel. All of these games are saying, here are the probability expectations, here are the dice that are being used, here's how good or bad a PC is expected to be. And that is all going to contribute to the game being balanced. Over time, the game being balanced means we feel it's fair. We feel that it's as expected. It's reliable, dependable. There will always be surprises because the dice are there and our decisions are there, but the underpinning of the game will be solid. So we want to have, we care because we want to have that balance as the underpinning. Then we can do all kinds of stuff to break it and have fun with it and be surprised by it. But the basics being stable means the game is reliable and lets us, in predictable ways, have fun and get surprised. If it's complete chaos, because we are blowing away the math of the game will no longer be reliable to do what it's supposed to do. And printed materials or guides or anything like that, the spells you choose, all of it is now sliding off of the probability scale. As you will see very soon, when we have multiple rolls or ways to boost rolls, if the challenge is based on that single roll, if that's the concept the game is providing for us, as it usually is, and if failure carries no consequence, meaning that every low die roll doesn't impose a consequence, then multiple rolls would trivialize the challenge, right? So we'll talk about the math of this, but if all 5 of us can just see what the glowing idol is about, chances are someone's going to succeed. And if it doesn't matter that, Sue rolled a 5 and Terry rolled a 10, because at least somebody rolled a 12, then there is no consequence for failure, and we're just guaranteeing success or vastly improving the chances of success without any kind of tension there, right? Narrative tension. Interestingly, some games do that. So both Daggerheart and Draw Steel minimize the chance that all players will want to just roll the dice, because in those games, failing can make things worse, and rolling is dangerous, right? So Daggerheart, for example, half the time you roll, you're generating fear. That empowers the DM to do things. Even outside of combat, having more fear means that the next time combat starts up, the GM can empower their actions, and this is going to result in harder fights. So if everybody rolls, even if, say, 5 players, 3 people succeed, that's still 2 points of fear that we generated by all just chucking dice at the table. Now we don't really want to do that, right? That's a lot of fear and more than the game expects in fear. So the DGM is the one that ends up sort of winning. In Draw Steel, when the director declares that there is a test, if you, based on the difficulty of the test, you rolling low, getting a tier 1 or tier 2 result, even depending on the challenge, will mean that you can have a complication. And so if everybody were rolling, there would be a bunch of complications and consequences from that roll that would also make it bad. So generally in Draw Steel, the system, just in Daggerheart as well, the system is built in not wanting to roll a bunch. But D&D generally does not have that, and a number of other games don't have that either. But let's take a look at the math. And for this, I'm going to be using, as I mentioned before, the adventure tools that I make available to Patreon people. And thank you to Patreon people who support my work. I really appreciate it. Truly, truly. There's going to be some fun stuff coming up. Those folks facilitate my making this tool that has many things. One of them is it lists by tier what you can expect to have the results. And it also reminds you of what the difficulty classes are as found in the SRD. So we've got our difficulty. We know what can we expect out of the different characters. And we can go to a tool like anydice.com and see what the different dice probabilities will be. In this example, we're going to have a D&D character at tier 1. So they're fairly low level. They are skilled in whatever the applicable skill is. In this case, let's say it's Arcana. And they have their primary ability as the ability where that skill is based. So in this case, intelligence. They don't have expertise, which would be another +2, but they are a +5 to their roll, right? +2 for their proficiency, +3 as sort of the maximum they could have with their primary ability. So they're really good at this, right? +5. And in this case, we're going to say this is a medium difficulty. A medium difficulty is DC 15 by the book. And we are expecting to have a fair chance of failure. This isn't easy. This isn't trivial. This is medium, but it's also not hard to where, it is a small chance. So what does that mean when we have a D20 +5 trying to get a result of 15 or higher? Well, it means a 55% chance at victory. So you're rolling that D20, you've got a +5, you're very good at this, you're looking at that idol with your Arcana, you've got a 55% chance, so just a little bit over half that you're going to succeed, right? Not easy, right? It's a medium test, so that's the way the game intends it to be. Now, what happens if we just start with somebody, the cleric says, hey, you know what? Before you make that roll, let me cast guidance on you. And I should mention that if you have expertise, the chance of success goes up to 65%. But how about with guidance? We get that cleric who says, hey, guess what? I've got the guidance cantrip. Let me cast that on you to give you that bonus D4 to your result. Now that 55% chance goes to being a 67.5% chance with guidance. So it's a 12.5% boost. That's significant, right? If the DC is 20, with guidance, it's a 42.5% chance. Without it, 30%. So it really can turn things to succeeding from almost a third to almost half the time, right? With a very hard DC, it becomes a big boost, right? That 12.5% boost from guidance is significant overall. Right now, of course, every time you roll, it could be a 4, it could be a 1. That can be a very big difference boost and what your D20 does. But overall, it is a significant improvement to have guidance. Let's talk about multiple rolls. So let's paint the picture where there's this arcane idol that everybody's looking at. The one character begins to go forward, but then everybody wants to roll. We have 5 party members. Let's say that they have a +2 bonus for just simplicity of math. And everybody is going to roll that DC 15 check to figure out with Arcana what this idol is like. We're rolling 5 d20s, and we want to know whether somebody rolls a 13 or higher, which will give us that DC 15. That 67.5% chance goes to 92.2%, right? 5 people rolling d20s with +2 bonus, 92.2% chance that somebody is rolling a 15 or higher. So you can see that's a real significant boost, right? That is no small boost at all. This is really blowing away the math of the expectations. And even if you wanted to say, like, what are our chances of rolling a 15 or higher, right? So that we have to get a 17, that is an 0.919% chance that one of the 5 is rolling a 15, or at least one of the 5 is rolling a 15 or higher. So you can see multiple rolls vastly change the math of the game. Allowing everybody to roll, even a few to roll, is going to really increase that chance. Let's take a look, speaking of multiple rolls, at the help action. Without the help action, we have that 1d20 plus 5. That was a 55% chance of success. When you add advantage, how does that change? With advantage, you're rolling those 2d20s. You have a 79.75% chance of getting a 15 or higher. So that is, 24.75% chance increase for that advantage. That is significant, in part in this case because your +5 bonus is pretty high. That helps, but it's a lot. And if you have help from somebody and guidance, where you're rolling 2d20s, adding +5, and adding the d4 from guidance, that's an 89.13% chance of getting a 15 or higher. And again, this is reasonably difficult, right? It is medium difficulty. So you are now taking something that was 55% chance, ballooning it up by 34.13% chance. That is a lot, right? Does 89% chance sound to you like medium? No, that's really easy, right? An 89% chance is well worth doing always. Very low chance of failure. We are breaking the game's expectations of what it means to interact with a dangerous arcane idol. So is that bad? It depends, right? It really depends on what we're trying to do in the game. And what I'd like to say here is we want some dependability, right? We want that stable base of understanding what the game expects. So we, the people playing the game and the director running the game, or the DM running the game, the GM, we can make decisions based on a solid underpinning of the game to decide how we want something to be, right? Having everybody roll could be great, or it could be disastrous based on the type of scene we are creating. So let's talk about some of these options, right? When should we use multiple checks? I like using multiple checks when we want to create engagement. And I've said before, sometimes folks feel like you should not make a lot of die rolls. And what should matter are the ideas you come up with, the interaction ideas. So there is this magical idol. I should ask intelligent questions about it, figure things out, maybe try things, interact with it. And that is totally fine too. I like that as a style of play, right? Ideas that give you rewards. I also like rolling dice. I feel that when you roll a lot of dice, you create engagement. Even when there are no consequences to it, no chance of failure, rolling dice done deliberately as a way to engage players can be neat. So I like multiple checks when there is either no consequence or only minor consequences to the roll. Everybody rolling can be fun, can keep everybody awake at the table, right? Somebody asked a question about this town. Give me a history check to see if anyone remembers rumors about the town and the tavern that you see before you, right? Everybody rolls. This gets everybody awake and having a stake in it, thinking about things. And to those people that got the highest results, I then speak to directly and explain what happened, right? And I improvise what I dole out, how much information to give based on that roll. But even the lowest, if everybody at the table rolls a 1, I would give them basic information they know about the town, basic information about that tavern. The higher you roll, the more that I can characterize it and let you know things up front. However I adjudicate, right? It's very similar to the interaction of, somebody, say, spending the time to talk to NPCs or all these things, right? Figure out by messing around. But here the role is just simplifying that play while keeping everybody engaged. And that can, for pacing reasons, for many other reasons, work better than just forcing everybody to interact with things and not rolling dice. But this is all scenario where people can disagree. But getting back to the subject of multiple checks, this is a case where I think multiple checks are great. When you just want to create engagement, get everybody rolling some dice, everybody's, doing something, that is a great reason to do it. But this is an area with minor or no consequences, so that everybody rolling low just means a little bit less info. That's fine, right? This arcane idol is probably not what I would say as an example of this, because this is exciting. It's the treasure room. This is probably the guardian. We want to figure things out. There are repercussions to failing. Everybody rolling doesn't feel right, even if the idol is right there in front of everybody. So a multiple check, one of the things it can help you do is help you, the DM, assess how well the players understand something, right? That idea of entering town. How many rumors have they heard about the town? The DM, by seeing how everybody rolls, gets a feeling, like an informal survey of, okay, that person doesn't know anything. That person doesn't. These three people really know a lot about the town. Let me give them some clues, right? That is useful. You are surveying your player knowledge in essence. And that can exist for any kind of situation or role where that would make sense. And again, low consequence to any failure. Now, when it comes to single checks, and also the question of how do you impose that in the fiction, single checks should be the default when we want a challenge, right? That's because the math of the game is favoring that. It's expecting this. So it's good for players and GMs at a meta level to just understand, look, this is your game. This is what we're doing. We are playing an experience together. The math of the game is based on this kind of interaction. And if you break it, we're breaking the game, right? So understanding that. The basic way to overcome a challenge is a single roll that doesn't have guidance and doesn't have advantage. Those things are boosts that are infrequent, right? Adding either guidance or advantage is a significant boost, as we saw. It's not nearly as big as both combined. It's not nearly big as doing that and lots of rolls, but it's still a significant boost. So gameplay-wise, we want players and DM or GM or director to understand the expectation of good gameplay at that meta level. And because we're all friends having a communal experience, work with that. At the fiction level, it can be a bit harder, right? Sometimes it makes sense. Like someone needs to pick the lock or disarm the trap. 5 people crowding around this lock or around this trap. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. We can easily make a reasonable argument. Only one of you can really focus this on this right now and make that roll. But, looking at the idol, that's kind of hard to do, right? Or searching for tracks, or trying to get a read on the possibly duplicitous NPC where everybody wants to make an insight check. We can lean a bit on the gameplay here, right? We can break the wall a bit and say, hey, I want you to choose one person to take the lead on this effort. And that's the kind of wording I'll use. If I see everybody starting to roll, I go, whoa. Yes, all of you are looking at this idol, but I want you to choose one person who's going to make this check representing what you all learn about this. Because that's what the game is doing. The game is expecting a single roll, even though all of you might look at the idol and figure something out. It's just not what the math of the game is expecting. And so we want to go back to that expectation if this is to be a challenge. So that's where the idea of saying choose one person works, right? We can sometimes explain it like searching for tracks. Yes, you all could, but you'll get in each other's way, obscuring tracks. One person steps here, which is where a person was about to look. We can explain in some cases just looking at an idol. No, somewhat, maybe like we confuse each other all shouting things, but it's a meta understanding. And so that's where saying choose one person to symbolize your efforts, right? You're all trying to get a read on the NPC. You all get a certain amount of understanding, but I want to pick one of you, spotlight one of you to represent your efforts to figure out whether they're trustworthy. And this idea is that the role, what it's capturing is the back and forth statements. It doesn't have to replace it, right? So one of the things we can do is we can still be doing a lot of back and forth role playing. And in that case, everybody can participate. You ask a question, you ask a question, you ask a question. All those questions might together mean that you all don't care what the dice say. You've got your understanding. That's great. That's play as intended. But when it comes to confirming it through the die roll, that's where we want one person to roll. Now, you listening to this may have a slightly different feel in that. That's fantastic. But what I'm just trying to point out is these are the possible tools we can turn to, right? If we want to have the game work off of the intended challenge level, then we need some way to say to our players, hey, Pick a leader. That's the person that's going to make this roll. Even when it may not fully be supported by the fiction, and we want to, because we're all good friends and we're playing a game that involves probability, work with them. So what about help and guidance? When do we allow for that? Baked into these things is the understanding that these are fine in moderation, right? The gameplay wise, especially when there are moments that there is no time pressure, when everybody's grouped together, using help or guidance works great. In fact, I might say that in this case of this statue, help and guidance could work, right? There is no ticking time bomb. There is no pressure. If you sat here for 20 minutes, nothing would happen in this treasure chamber. Yeah, help and guidance probably makes sense. And when designing the challenge, I'd probably take that into account, right? So yeah, two people can look at the statue and, one of them has guidance on them. Great, we can do that. But we want to be reasonable with it, right? Guidance requires touch as a range. It is an action. So it's a kind of thing that you have to have the foresight to cast it right before that person does something. And so we want that to make sense, that this is a situation where we're not just rushing into the treasure room with enemies. That's where you wouldn't have had a chance to cast guidance. You would have probably been worried about the people behind you. And so we don't want to apply it in that sense. But when there is time, when you're right next to each other, guidance can work. Help, similarly, you probably want to be right next to them to help them with the thing. You're interacting in some way. And so we want to tone down that frequency to where it makes sense. And we want to, as players, say, hey, is it cool if I help? I'd like to, DM, could I help them in this situation? Right? DM, could I cast guidance? And if you find it's annoying to ask whether you can do these things, it's because you're asking it so much, right? And there are times, I recently ran tables where people had paid a lot of money to play the table, because it's part of the D&D XP track at a convention. I just let them do it because they're paying for a good time. I don't mind I didn't have to challenge them in this way. And so having high success on skill tests was okay. I didn't have a problem with that in this context. In my home game, I don't want it at that frequency, right? Or in a different context, a more typical Adventures League, Legends of Greyhawk type organized play table, I want the math to be a bit more like what the game represents. And that's where I want players to be reasonable. And I'll say, hold on, choose a leader and so on, or you're too far away. Or I would say that, they're doing this quickly enough that you don't get the chance to help them or cast guidance. But just be aware that as a DM, what it means for this in the game. And lots of games have a help action, so it's not just D&D, right? Or have some sort of boost or ability. Just be aware of how that changes the math up. And if you're expecting, a good chance that the idol is going to trigger whatever it does, then we don't want an 88% chance or something like that, right? So hopefully that helps, thinking through that fiction of when to do these different checks. Let's talk about one last thing, which is group checks. So a group check is exactly where the game actually expects you to work as a team and roll multiple checks. That's why it's called a group check versus just a skill check. This is a special check where every player tries the check. If half or more succeed, is generally the way it works, the entire group succeeds. The collective effort is shaping the result, right? It's not about boosting the one person. It's really about everybody doing a thing. So when should we use those? We want to use these really when the fiction represents it. It's not generally going to be about the idol, right? That is a case where we have a yes-no switch. Is this idol something we can figure out, that we understand what it's doing in this treasure room? That is a yes-no. Collective effort, the question isn't learning something or not. It's whether we pass a test collectively, right? So everybody's traveling through the wilderness, and we want to know if everybody does so capably, or whether we are maybe exhausted by our efforts, or aren't able to heal as we're traveling, or whether we learn important things as we travel through the wilderness. A group check now gets to represent everybody's travel. We're all rolling to see how we'll do, knowing that some of us are good at it and some of us are bad at it. Generally, in group checks, we will say that we're not going to use things like help and guidance. Guidance especially, because that is a single thing and you can't be expecting to just constantly guidance yourself through everything you're doing in the wilderness. There are going to be times when you do, times when you don't, so we're just not going to use that. Help, sometimes rules will allow help instead of your own check. So you could say, I'm going to help you because you're doing the bulk of the action. I give you the help action instead of rolling myself. That is sometimes fine to have one person do that, right? That could work. But the whole point is that this collective effort is shaping the result. So if everybody's sneaking, if everybody's searching, right? Everybody's sneaking through to get to the front door. Everybody's searching this place for clues. Everybody trying to move a big boulder together. Together, we figure out whether if more than half succeeded, then yes, you found the thing you were looking for. You were able to sneak past the guards. You were able to move the big boulder. Those mechanics and flavor, that's great for a group check. It's less useful for something like this yes, no, idle, right? If I were to do a group check for something like this treasure room, it might be that there are multiple things in the room. And so it's whether we can figure all those out. But I want some way for the collective to show up, that it's not just something where for a person doing a single, think of it this way, if a single check succeeded, does that end the test? Then it doesn't work, right? So if we're getting past the idol, that would make sense, right? Like maybe there's an idol at the beginning, and the question is, can everybody make a test to get through? And maybe we allow your choice of Arcana or sneaking. So you could decide the narrative of it. And one way to think about a group check is, could you build a montage, a cinematic type montage about this, right? And I've got a video on cinematic montages, but could you say like, yeah, and then my character, created this arcane shield that blocked the eye beams that fired out of this idol. And another person says, and what I did was pick up a piece of rock and cover it over my head to protect myself. And someone else just snuck past, and where we can all tell our own story and no one story ended things. That's a group check, right? So if we change that challenge of getting past these defenses, then that might be something that allows for a group check narratively and makes it more fun to do that. It isn't going to work for something like finding the murder weapon in the room, because we will find it and it would stop. It is a good way, it can be a good way to do that if there's some other variable. So for example, we say you're trying to find the murder weapon in the room before the noble returns to their room. And now we're explaining that everybody's action matters because time is of the essence. And the more successes, that's the faster everybody worked together to find the murder weapon. You found some torn sheets. You found that the bed had been disturbed. You picked up the mattress and we found the dagger, right? Something like that. So that is a way to do it, is to add some other variable to this on-off switch. Time is an easy one that makes a group check work narratively. I hope this has been helpful for you in thinking through, even if you're a very experienced GM, how to look at the idea of multiple PCs trying to help. And for players as well, maybe it gave you something to think about what your DM is trying to do when they create a task and how it's impacted by either a bunch of people trying to roll dice or casting spells and doing other things that would help. It really does change the math significantly, and understanding this can make for a better game, I hope. Thank you to everybody in my Patreon that makes these videos possible, and I'll see you next time.